Next to the stage, please welcome Jim Kharouf, Head of Marketing and Communications, IncubEx.
I don't want to be alone, so hey everybody. Hope you guys enjoyed lunch. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'm Jim Kharouf. I'm Head of Marketing and Communications with IncubEx. We're a firm that develops and designs voluntary and compliance markets. Today, I'm really honored to host this esteemed panel of experts, and I'm just going to jump right in. We have David LaGreca, Voluntary Carbon Market Services Director with Ecoengineers. To his right, we have JP Brisson, Partner and Head of the Climate Change Practice at Latham and Watkins. And to my right, I have Chelsea Bryant, Managing Director and Head of the Carbon Advisory with BMO Capital Markets. It's safe to say it's been a tumultuous time in the voluntary carbon markets these last couple of years. The question today is whether we're going to remain there or move forward. There are a number of positive developments recently that point the arrow upward. And of course, there are some challenges for the market, just like any other. We'll look at the market status today, some political impacts, what we're seeing in the market itself, cover some integrity initiatives, and then we'll end with a short lightning round and some questions, hopefully, from you as well. So let's kick it off with your take on the VCM. How would you describe the market now and its potential in the coming year? And I'll start with you, Chelsea.
Thanks so much, Jim. I think that anyone's been involved in environmental commodity markets for a long time has to have an internal level of optimism. So I will say that I will probably come across as an optimistic voice on the panel. We've certainly seen, and the voluntary carbon market has been around for an extraordinarily long period of time. So this isn't something that's new in the last 2 years, although we've seen a lot of volatility. But it's really important to focus on the level of corporate action that we're seeing, the level of commitment, but also look at it from a time frame basis. Because ultimately, when you're thinking about the voluntary carbon market, it's really important to look at the time frame that these commitments are made over, because again, they are voluntary commitments. And so as we head closer and closer toward the 2030 time frame, we can expect to see action increase as organizations have made commitments that can't necessarily all be made or met within their own Scope 1, Scope 2 emission reductions. And so, again, when you're thinking about participation in a voluntary carbon market, the individual organizations that are making these commitments ultimately have to look within their own emissions as a first step. They have to assess. There's a considerable amount of planning, strategizing, looking at how they want to participate in the market, what the strategy around that is. And again, this isn't a highly commoditized product, although we have exchanges that are obviously working very hard to create products that will make it more commoditized, but it's still very bespoke. It's individual project by project level due diligence. It's looking at an individual project and understanding, is it technically viable, and is it viable in terms of the co-benefits that it's ultimately creating. And so there's a lot of work and infrastructure that needs to be developed, even on an individual corporate by corporate level, to execute successfully on those strategies, and that takes time. And so I think we're going to notice a trend as we talk about this topic today about all the steps that need to be taken in order to successfully execute on those strategies, what that ultimately means, and how that increases in terms of, as we get closer to some of these key deadlines, 2030, 2050, what does that look like? But also how much time it takes for these projects to come online and what that means in terms of action that we need to take today. So again, I hope to form a view that's optimistic on the panel today, and I think that there's a lot of key changes that are happening over time, and it's really going to be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, that's great. David, what's your take?
My take is this is an incredibly dynamic market, and it remains such. If anybody is seeking a stable place for consistent activities and the same day in, day out business, like probably not in this room right now. So I think it's an exceptional place for opportunity building, and the market is just providing more opportunities in the face of some historical disasters in 2 years ago, where we're all here with kind of head in hands, like what do we do now after getting kicked in the teeth by media and others. And I think there's been a remarkable amount of progress to date with people who are fighting back on the narrative through actions, both on the corporate side and on the project development side. There's a lot of very positive motions there. I think the challenges now are kind of coming from different directions. So there's a lot less infighting than there was over the last couple of years, with the different sects, if you will, within this market, kind of vying for viability at the expense of others. I think that's been quieted to a large degree, and I think that's a very positive advancement. Corporate commitments have been hushed or subtly shifted in the way of moving some projects from offsets to insets, or to just kind of other types of corporate actions. And yeah, I think that there's more chance for optimism now, even in with political headwinds, than we have room for any kind of dismissive notions of this market. I also think that there's it's not time to just go and seek out hope from convergence in all the markets and all the places in the world. I think this market has to stand on its own, and it's based off of individual, corporate, and government commitments combined. And the VCM has always withstood the impacts of waves of economic transition and of the desires of individuals, corporations. So it's always withstood those waves, and it will stand on its own. I'm pretty solidly sure of that.
Okay, that's cool. We got two optimists. JP, are you a third?
I think so. Look, there's been contraction in the last couple of years, but there's nothing surprising there. As we said, at Goldman, trees don't grow to the sky. There are cycles in the market. For those of you who were in the market in 2007, we had one in 2007, 2012. We had adjustments when Bingham and Specter and Lieberman did not pass. So we've seen cycles in this market for the last 25 years, compliance and voluntary. So we just went through a cycle in the voluntary carbon market. But given everything that's happened, I think 2024 was a surprisingly fairly robust year. I was listening yesterday to a speech from Mary Grady from ACR, who was indicating that 2024 was a marquee year for ACR, both in terms of issuance and retirement, which to me was extremely interesting to hear. If you look at the market, last year, I picked one deal, right? And you announced a deal with Total, $100 million, right? And this year, we just advised a Chestnut on a deal with Microsoft, and that is the largest deal ever done in the voluntary carbon market, right? It happened here in the US. So I am optimistic because despite everything we're seeing, and we'll talk about the Trump administration in a second, I'm still seeing quite a significant amount of deal activity.
Yeah, that sounds great. So why don't you pick it up from there? Like, what's your take on the Trump administration and its impact, or even maybe internationally, kind of what you're seeing politically, and kind of its impact on this? It's a global market, right? So.
Yeah, it is a global market. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I do a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, for example. They're all in. The investment and the activity that's going into the energy transition globally, but also the creation of carbon asset is very significant. So the European system is also moving in, continuing to grow fairly strongly. I'm surprised that the Trump administration's policies have not had more of an impact on the market. I was actually speaking earlier today with Senator Stern. It's interesting, right? I think there's been a lot of backlash on ESG and DEI, those labels, right? And I think some companies are, taking a step back vis-a-vis those. But I think in a lot of companies, people are, putting climate on a separate track, right? So I'm aware of 2 oil companies that have, reduced their activities in the market in Europe, 2 European oil and gas companies. But for example, in the tech sector in the US, there hasn't been a significant reduction of the commitment by the big tech companies, including those that are purchasing carbon credits in the VCM. So I have been surprised that so far, to me, it hasn't been a significant impact.
Yeah, Chelsea, from your vantage point, like what are you seeing out there?
It's interesting. I think like the political piece, when you think about compliance markets, is incredibly important. So I've spent my career throughout compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets, both from a trading and carbon advisory perspective. And clearly election cycles are incredibly important when you're thinking about compliance markets, especially markets that don't necessarily have, significant entrenched support that lasts for a very long period of time, or where ultimately there's large sources of revenue generation that come from those programs. So we've definitely seen ebbs and flows. I think on the voluntary carbon market, it's so important to focus on your sources of demand are obviously going to be based on corporate level commitments. And so we're not seeing like a vast retraction of those commitments. If anything, we see organizations that are looking at this and saying, what does long-term resiliency from our organization look like beyond any single government administration's tenure? And so I think that's the right view to have, because again, even when we see governments that are extraordinarily favorable for carbon policy and markets, that doesn't necessarily immediately translate to demand either. So it's really important to look at where's that action coming from. If I think about compliance markets, oftentimes it's even at a state level or at a provincial level that's driving that. Then you can have where the federal government comes in and puts programs in that have that draw to drive action at a state and at a provincial level. But on the voluntary side, again, we're really at the tip of the iceberg. Like, it's still actually quite early days when you look at the level of commitments made by organizations versus the participation and retirement that's happened. A lot of these targets were, starting to step towards those. And so ultimately there's so much more that needs to happen for even a fraction of those targets to be met. And ultimately, like coming from having, past life on the industrial side, there isn't just this untapped resource of all these economically viable emission abatement projects that can be done within your own operations. It can very quickly, when you look at the marginal cost of abatement curve, get quite expensive. And so the great thing about markets is it's a very capital efficient way to meet an objective. And so the great thing about the voluntary carbon market is it's a capital efficiency and can drive in private investment into these projects that ultimately lead to those same objectives. So it's capital efficient. And so it's really important to think about where we are in that story, and we're actually quite still near the beginning. The other piece that's going to drive demand for VCM projects is, as we see, and we'll talk about later in the panel, I'm sure, some of the voluntary to compliance conversion. And so when you're thinking again about compliance markets, then you really need to think about how different administrations could or could not impact those. And that certainly can be an interesting one that I'm sure we'll dig into more.
Yeah, for sure. David, from your perspective, are you hearing, politics getting in the way of projects? What's your view on that?
The quick answer is yes. Big commitments from big corporates are definitely taking a hit when they can't securely work on leveraging, say, 45Z or some other Inflation Reduction Act grant, or the grants have been withheld. I mean, it's directly problematic for deployment of further capital and for reaching financial investment decision on big projects. It's disastrous in some ways. But I'd say federal financing is only one of 3 ways that kind of propel markets, like voluntary carbon credit markets. So there's federal and government incentives, then there's the corporate drive, and then there's the investment drive, which kind of operates somewhat independently, but like in kind of tracing those other 2 movements. So I still see the corporate drive is everybody heard this term kind of wait and see to some degree. It's kind of an extension of the wait and see from media impacts from a couple of years ago, but it's a little bit of wait and see from an investment standpoint on kind of that end of the spectrum. But there's still a lot of good projects that are underway that are going to keep moving forward, albeit somewhat altered from their original programs. The really big ones that are supported by particular tax credits are definitely being hindered today.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the markets. How would you say it's evolving? What are you seeing in terms of CDRs and maybe combining projects in new and interesting ways? Why don't you talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about how this market is really evolving in kind of across different assets, across different types of projects.
Yeah. So, like I said, everybody's kind of just coming. This market changes all the time. The different influences outside and inside are changing really, really consistently, and I don't think that's anything really new. But the way that project developers are reacting. Using an example from the carbon dioxide removal market is rather than pure play CDR credit projects, there's a lot of companies who are selling co-products or focusing on that as a secondary way to find financial viability, because that will allow at least some kind of a buffer against credit market either liquidity issues or of any other market dynamics. So that's interesting. That other interesting thing is the kind of convergence or alignment of offset projects and protocols being utilized for insetting purposes, and that inset market kind of evolving around both removals and avoidance project types, but it's kind of a dramatic new alternative to pure play carbon credit projects where you're going after corporates directly and aligning with supply chain actions and activities rather than relying on an independent credit market that is less than efficient at times. So it's great to see companies and to help them to kind of find those new outlets for finance.
Just to make sure we're on the same page, can you define insetting for all of us? You referred to insetting, right?
Yeah, so insetting and offsetting, they're sometimes two sides of the same coin, similar type of project activity, like let's use farm practice activity of reduction in the intensity of carbon for a farming practice, or the accumulation of soil organic carbon just through, and then being able to sell that credit, either externalize it and transact it independently to some company who wants to decarbonize in their scope 1 most of the time type of ambitions, or rather than doing that, selling it directly to a consumer production good or like some agricultural adjacent company for direct decarbonization activities. And there's different standards, a level of rigor that's kind of involved. So it's not as not simple as offsetting markets are. It's even slightly more convoluted at times, aligning with the final corporate owner of that attribute. But
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe just, I was going to just
Go ahead.
jump in on the CDR side. I think it's really interesting, especially when you're looking at, say, more capital intensive projects, look at, say, technology-based CDRs. I don't think there can be an expectation from the market that there's going to be large spot volumes available. So if you're thinking about this from a corporate strategy and you're saying, I want to participate, and maybe it's, I want to participate exclusively in this project type, or I want to blend it into an overall strategy, realistically, where we see projects on the CDR side is that a lot of them are requiring offtakes in order for those projects to get to final investment decision and then ultimately to be built. And so by the time you're looking at that, the credit supply has already been sold. So there's likely going to be very minimal, or at least to a certain extent over the next, say several years, minimal spot volume available in some of these more expensive, long duration carbon dioxide removal projects. So it's important to think, if you want access to that specific project type, where you need to look at in terms of the strategy around that, it might be looking at like a long-term offtake to be able to access it at a material volume of credits. The other thing I thought that was really interesting that you said was around the large scale, very capital intensive, say CCUS projects, and if they're not being, having these heavy government subsidies, then will they get built? completely agree with that point, but I actually think it's interesting if you're looking at the cost of those projects and the return that they ultimately need, if that's met by a government subsidy, then you're not ultimately also creating credits, because then you question like what's the additionality of that credit if it's already being funded by the government. So it's interesting to think about if you don't see that large project happen and there's still the commitment, and an organization, if they can't meet their commitment, are they going to abandon that commitment? Are they going to change that commitment? Or they have to participate in the voluntary carbon market if they don't have other opportunities? And so we're not seeing, again, large scale corporates backing away from these commitments. If anything, again, it's looking at it from a longer term view. And so ultimately, we're marching closer and closer towards these targets, and that's going to put more impetus into participating in the market if there aren't those opportunities to otherwise reduce your emissions in your own scope 1 and 2.
Yeah, yeah. JP, you good? So, one of the things that we also wanted to talk about was the idea of convergence, in terms of, the compliance and the voluntary markets, and, where that might happen, where that might make sense, where we might see increase. It's not necessarily new, but just in terms of the level of involvement between the two markets. And, I know you have a take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we can see examples of this right now. There's like lots of great conversations that are happening around the conference about CORSIA. So when you think about overarching projects that can meet a specific compliance market, it's not that there is necessarily all these incremental activities that are going to suddenly like appear out of nowhere. Oftentimes, if you're looking at a system like CORSIA, it's credits that would have, sold as voluntary credits in absence of the program. And then if they're able to meet the specific criteria of the program, they can be sold. Or there might be other regional or country level programs that come into existence and they say, okay, this specific type of credit is now eligible under my system. And so now you're actually looking at the whole universe of what is a voluntary carbon credit. And some subset of that might meet this system, and some subset of that might meet that system, and so then you see changes in pricing. And we've actually even seen this within compliance markets in the past, where different compliance markets might have the same two activities eligible to create a compliance grade credit, and which market provides you the best return. And so you would potentially optimize that selection by saying, okay, if I'm creating this and this becomes a higher value, I'm gonna switch to this credit. Even in the heyday when it was a very hot voluntary market and prices were like running up at an unprecedented rate, we saw the backwards of that, where if the voluntary market price got higher for a credit than the compliance market price, suddenly people were selling into that voluntary demand. So realistically, you have to look at this holistically and say, what is the best commercial optimal strategy for these environmental attributes? Sometimes they're stacking between different programs, and how can I ultimately optimize the value for this project, and what does that look like? And these things are changing. It's constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. Voluntary market standards are changing, compliance markets are changing, they're coming into existence, and how do these things all interact? And then when you look at them each individually, this is going to impact the market fundamentals of each segment. So what does that look like over time?
Yeah. JP, what's your take on it?
I think that's an important question, because from my perspective, when a product becomes a compliance product, it creates liquidity, and it also isolates the product and the person using the product from certain criticism, right? So, issues around integrity, credibility, et cetera, they don't come up. For example, let's say California, someone is using an offset in California to comply with the cap and trade program. As a general matter, these companies have not been subject to criticism by anyone because, one, the product is a compliance offset, and second, the company using the product is doing so for the purpose of meeting a legal obligation. So, from a criticism perspective, right, it's not, not the same risk. Personally, what I think is going to be very interesting over the next 5 years is to see how Article 6 and the Paris Agreement will impact the VCM as it relates to international projects. There's a lot of criticism around, international voluntary carbon credit transaction and projects today. But the minute these projects are correspondingly adjusted against the inventory of a host nation, and they become a compliance credit under the Paris Treaty, in my sense, it acquires a level of credibility which is different than having a purely, voluntary project. So I think it is possible that, within 3 or 4 years, the vast majority of the transactions at the international level, not in the US, of course, but at the international level, will be Article 6 transaction or quasi-Article 6 transaction because of the corresponding adjustment on the ledger of the host nation. And that will bring a convergence between the voluntary market and the compliance market at the international level, which in my view will catalyze additional investments and create liquidity. And that is something I look forward to.
Yeah, that's great. So, there's multiple markets on which you guys can, buy and sell voluntary carbon credits today. Just the most recent entrance looks like Amazon Sustainability Exchange, but that just adds to the list of venues. I'm just curious, Chelsea and David, from your perspective, what do markets have to offer today? At least from a project perspective, and just getting some, clarity or even efficiency on the price for those projects. You want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I think marketplaces do support a market, but they do not themselves establish said market.
Yeah.
I think there's a big value in order to provide that availability. Not even just liquidity, but just like availability of credits. Because unlike some markets where you literally go on Amazon until very recently, and you still just can't log on to Amazon and buy a whole bunch of credits. You have to have an account and due diligence and all these kind of steps. So it's still not a true over-the-counter process. There's still going to be, the emission reduction purchase agreements involved. There's still going to be all these extra steps that's different than going to buy a sandwich. And I don't think it'll ever be quite that way. But the marketplaces are helpful in they have the same ambition as the project developer in many instances of providing access to these projects, and they want to present those to a larger suite of buyers than a company who is project developing, a supply side partner will be able to reach. So I think they serve a purpose, and with the increasing standards that many of the marketplaces are putting on for the types of projects that can be transacted, there's just one more filter layer. One more stamp of approval. This market loves stamps of approval, and they're kind of providing that. Like, you're working with another trusted party along the way, and as long as there's not price gouging in that process, it's beneficial.
Yeah, Chelsea.
Yeah, I think it's really important to differentiate between getting access to spot volume and being able to access other projects that may not otherwise be available on that basis, whether it's a forward transaction or a long-term offtake, and where a lot of the projects that are considered the highest integrity, you wouldn't necessarily be able to access them if they're not on a marketplace. And so I kind of go back to, I agree with you. I think that the variety of different infrastructure partners are extraordinarily important, and certainly I've seen the value in my career of marketplaces and being able to access spot projects, seeing that volume, seeing that transparency in price, et cetera. But coming from a trading lens, I've spent my entire career negotiating bilateral agreements, and there is never two that seem to be the same in most cases. And working for a bank now, I know that they would love that everything was consistent and had no changes. I'm sure that my legal team would be extraordinarily happy. The trade desk at BMO would be extraordinarily happy. But I just haven't seen it, especially when you're thinking about doing forward transactions and long-term offtakes. There is no standard form of agreement. You are really entering into an individual negotiation, and it's important because the projects are different. There's different considerations depending on the jurisdiction you're working with, the counterparty you're working with, what you're specifically looking to do. And so, again, I always kind of go back to what is the problem we're solving for? So marketplaces can be great access to, again, that spot liquidity. But if you're thinking about having a long-term strategy and how you want to participate in this market, that doesn't mean that you can, show up on Monday morning, log on to your computer and press some buttons and get access to exactly what you want to do to execute on that strategy. That's just not feasible. A lot of this takes, significant preparation, engagement, negotiation to get access to the projects that you ultimately want to be a part of. And so I think it's really important to kind of highlight that capacity building is needed and that these things take a lot of steps.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just switch gears here a little bit, and the buzzword around the voluntary markets is always about integrity. So these days, and so JP, from your vantage point, we've been watching the market tackle integrity for some period of time now, and and provide some certainty. So what's your take on what we're seeing in terms of the integrity initiatives? What else is needed?
Well, I will tell you, I am very happy with the development that's taken place at the ICVCM over the last year and a half. I think the new leadership of the ICVCM, which was orchestrated, as you may know, by EDF, Environmental Defense Fund in the U.S., was very well played. And I'm seeing a lot of progress. It's probably not as quickly as we would want, but there's a lot of work to go through, and I think the organization is working as quickly as it can. And there's now good representation from a number of market participants in this room in the ICVCM in some ways that is really helping the process. I am not a strong supporter of SBTI. I think SBTI, when we close this chapter of the VCM, I think we will look back, and even though it was a very well-intended program, we will look back at SBTI as being something that basically, put us, 3 steps behind. And the attempts to reform SBTI that took place in 2024 have, in my view, failed. And I see a massive, trend of companies leaving SBTI over the next few years by not, renewing their commitment and essentially walking away from those that have been made. So that's my assessment. There's still a lot of work to be done. But on the ICVCM side, I think we're having some good indication of progress.
Yeah, that's great. So, David, from your vantage point, we're talking about 2 initiatives, the ICVCM as well as the SBTI. How do you see it? Like, where are we going with this?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a movement. Everybody wants everything to be standardized and uniform in a uniform fashion. For all data should be the same, and kind of all projects should look the same within these certain confines. And I think what we're finding is that there's no universal rule set that's going to be applicable to all projects, and any organization that's trying to be the kingmaker of perfection and integrity really needs to continue to evolve in that process, evolve in their perspective as the number of projects and as the demands of what off-takers and investors are looking for continue to get more and more advanced. We need to make sure that the standards are evolving with it. The greenhouse gas protocol, I think, is trying to keep up with claims guidance and trying to make advancements across a number of different categories. But these processes need to move quicker because these markets move instantly. And when there's a delay, there is projects that don't get done. So they need to move quicker. And science-based targets, I think it's very well intentioned, but there needs to be more of an initiative on action than just target setting. Target setting itself is not going to get us where we need to be. Today's action today needs to be propelled by the next set of standards that come out, and anything that's holding us back is problematic.
Can I just jump back in for a second? So the problem with SBTI is not the target setting. The problem is how to achieve the target once it's been set, and especially the restriction on the use of offsets, right? And number 2, and I'm sorry, Chelsea, I jumped in. You mentioned the Green Claims Directive. That's another big one, right? There are a lot of you who are actively working in Europe to advocate changes to the green claims proposal and directives, et cetera, that is very, very problematic from a market perspective. And I know that in the U.S. we have not paid enough attention to that. So I think we need to do a better job at monitoring this. And my apologies, Chelsea.
Yeah, no worries, Chelsea.
No worries at all. I think I'll just talk about like what we see happening in the market as a result of these. So ultimately, I think it does more damage when you have programs come out and villainize markets. So then it points to kind of creating that rhetoric of fear of participation. On the other side, we are seeing like some positive sentiments and changes, but that doesn't immediately translate into market demand. So just because we see an announcement come out where it's specifically approving a type of credit for this type of program, or it's increasing flexibility where it's even considering offsets, even if it's a very small subset of them, that doesn't immediately translate into demand the next day because organizations are looking at this information. So I actually think the programs end up being more harmful when they're going and saying very anti-market rhetoric, because ultimately, to JP's point, one of the challenges that SBTI has faced is it actually practical to meet what they're asking you to do? Is it economically feasible for your organization? If you're ultimately never going to be able to get there, then that's not going to be a successful program. So there needs to be consideration of if it's not economically feasible for you to achieve those objectives all within your own marginal cost of abatement curve in your own internal projects, then access to a market is the most capital effective and efficient way to ultimately meet those objectives without abandoning or vastly changing those targets. And so we need to be pragmatic. Otherwise, we have very significant challenges. On the other side, again, just by saying, okay, this specific program is allowing for these types of credits, it doesn't insulate you from a project that may be considered applicable to a program not having reputation or quality risks. So individual organizations are still setting up their own frameworks and processes and due diligence for how they want to participate in the market. So it's not just because it says that this isn't a red light that it necessarily is a green light for corporates. And so we're seeing an evolution and development of those strategies and then working with trusted partners to successfully execute on them. But again, I kind of re-emphasizing this, like as we head towards 2030, I kind of use the analogy of if you ever watch 5-year-olds play soccer, it's incredibly cute, but you have like a very large gaggle of children all running at the ball at the exact same time. And so we don't want to be 5-year-olds playing soccer. We don't all want to be running at the ball at the same time. So it's like taking those steps, doing, dipping the toe and building that capacity so that successful execution can happen, because emphasizing like these projects, as my fellow panelists have said, don't come online overnight. It actually takes, months, if not years, to get them up and running, and then creation of the environmental commodity. So a lot of this takes time that needs to be done up front. And so we're seeing organizations doing those capacity building activities, starting to participate and execute in advance of some of these key critical deadlines, so that once they get there, they're well prepared to be able to execute successfully and then access the high quality projects that they ultimately want to be participating in.
Right. So, and ultimately, I think we're talking about some of these initiatives, but we're also talking about market structure or the creation of market structure from time to time. Do you think that, we need to see more between Article 6 or even U.S., kind of government agencies overseeing these markets? Is that helpful? Is that what is needed to kind of enhance what we're trying to do on the integrity side? What are your thoughts about how that factors in?
Well, we are actually seeing compliance markets and registries start to consider the creation of different types of tags. So like there are programs. I spent many years of my life in Alberta, so I'll use that as an example. The Alberta program allows for voluntary retirement of offset credits, but also they now have a concept of a CDR tag or label associated with some of those credits. So we are seeing like different compliance programs. California's another example where they've talked about that specifically, like use of credits from a voluntary basis from their system. So you can see like some regulators come in and say, hey, if having us be that sort of trusted lens gives you more confidence in this is something you consider. That doesn't necessarily immediately, again, translate to voluntary demand, but it is an example of that. The other thing I would say is that like in absence of action, you tend to see, so if you have voluntary action that is driving towards different jurisdictions meeting their objectives, then you don't necessarily need that jurisdiction to come in with a policy to meet that objective. In absence of any action, then you typically see policies that are going to meet the objectives. Otherwise, you as a jurisdiction completely miss your objectives. And then if you have a market that's not functioning well and it's not actually meeting that policy objective, then you can see command and control regulations come in. And those tend to be the least capital efficient. and they tend to be the most painful. And so I always think kind of long game, what does this look like? If we don't take action, do you ultimately end up with an obligation that ends up being a cost? So is it instead of being able to generate, revenue or mitigate costs, does it become more expensive? And if you really don't have action, does that end up being actually quite punitive from an organizational basis, whether that's either from like investors demanding that type of action or from governments, requiring specific policies to be put forward so that you meet objectives at a jurisdictional level. So I'm a very pro-market person from a capital efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, David?
Yeah, I think governments can certainly support markets as long as they don't get, as long as the voluntary market doesn't get caught up on exclusively following that type of support. Because California has five protocols, I believe, that are eligible for generating offsets. There are 270 or more varieties of established carbon credit project types. So like governments can play a role in driving very solid action, but it will be in a targeted, narrow manner. So the vast majority of decarbonization activities will either be undertaken throughout a process of like voluntary crediting, or they will be done for direct decarbonization activities. I don't think that governments will ever be able to keep up with the broad approaches that the market comes up with. So I think it's certainly one tool, and it can drive a lot of good action in a few different directions. But I think in the carbon removal framework that's being developed in the European Union context, I think it's the methodology approval process is probably going to take a while. And so each one of the approaches will probably have a large number of participants that are actually activated and have a demand signal for whatever utility that is ultimately allowed by that project. But I still find the vast majority of action will be driven by creativity of project developers and innovation that governments can only somewhat support.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. JP, you mentioned Article 6. I'm going to bring up CORSIA as well. Do you see those as like major drivers of these markets going forward? And if so, kind of like, how will that take place? Or, will this be kind of a rapid uptake? Will it be, kind of a slow burn? Kind of what's your view on particularly Article 6 and CORSIA as these markets kind of have some more structure?
Yeah, well, so the good thing with Article 6 is that Baku, we finally got the final rules, right, of Article 6. So it is possible to do Article 6 transactions today. I think there's a lot of confusion in the market about the need to have a bilateral agreement in place to do an Article 6 transaction. That is completely incorrect under the text of the Paris Agreement and the decisions that followed, including in Glasgow. So we're seeing a lot of interesting transactions. I think there is in between now and the time when we have a fully operational Article 6. I think, meaning a more developed market for Article 6. I think there can be some confusion between the difference between a voluntary carbon market that is not Article 6 and an Article 6 project in a developing country. But I think that's going to get sorted over time. The problem with these, of course, is that, if someone does a CDR project in the US, it's impossible to do an Article 6 transaction, right? So there were a lot of investments taking place in the US, the purpose of which was to create a CDR that would be correspondingly adjusted at some point. But, if the US is not in the Paris Treaty, then it's impossible to do, right? So there are limitations to these programs.
Yeah. So we're coming up on about a little over 10 minutes, and I do want to leave the floor open for some questions. So let's take this. What should corporates be thinking about right now if they have a plan in place, or maybe even be coming up short on their 2030 goals? Kind of talk to a lot of corporates, like what are you telling them? What are some of the processes or things they should be thinking about today in anticipation of the years to come here?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that there's pragmatic solutions that can be done. BMO put out actually a great white paper on voluntary carbon market participation. And so It really depends on your type of organization, the sector that you're involved in. So we see like, great corporate action and leadership across a myriad of different sectors. Different sectors have different reasonable like cost of carbon on a per ton basis that can be achieved based on their own like emissions footprint. So you have a very different consideration if you're a very emissions intensive industry versus not, and how that specifically is looked at. Certainly the first thing you need to do is understand where your own opportunities to abate exist and whether they're economically and technologically feasible, because it's not just, can I do this, like does the cost make sense, but does the technology actually exist in a way that can be effectively deployed and meet my operational standards? Like there's a lot of complexity there. And so what does that look like? And then once you've assessed that, then participation in the voluntary carbon market can be a very economically efficient way to meet those objectives. But ultimately you have to execute on a strategy, and that requires development of it. What does that look like? What is a reasonable cost on a per ton basis that I can be achieving these objectives? And then what kind of projects do I ultimately want to look at to meet that composition and objectives that align with my overall brand strategy, et cetera. So like, am I looking at specific jurisdictions, specific project types? And actually on a per project basis, you really are looking at a due diligence because you don't want to ultimately not have comfort with the specific projects that you're getting involved in. And so I would say like the best thing to do is to start to take baby steps to start doing that capacity building. Like it's not something that can be done overnight, and certainly accessing, as I mentioned before, the projects that you might want to be accessing can be something that needs to be considered in the future, especially if you're looking at long duration removals projects. Like those are projects, if you're contracting today, aren't going to deliver for several years. And so it's important to consider like the time frame and what that looks like, especially as we're marching closer and closer towards 2030. But I would say that, we see across our client base that, organizations aren't necessarily going to be at the targets as they've set for 2030. And so ultimately you're looking at those targets. Are they going to be adjusted or shifted or changed, or are you going to see participation in the voluntary carbon market? And I think we certainly are seeing participation in the market.
Yeah.
But with an increased focus on things like CDRs.
Yeah, that's great. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to open it up so I don't do all the questions myself. So does anybody have a question from the audience? We'd love to hear from you. If not, I do have more questions. Yeah? Okay. If anybody thinks of anything, please go ahead and raise your hand. In terms of, ultimately, the private sector, David, is, going to continue to fuel demand. What do you think the market needs to do to, kind of trigger that demand, and also not only trigger it, but also, meet it and expand these markets?
I think it kind of goes back to your last question a little bit about what do companies do if they're not meeting their targets, and it's act now, don't move the goalposts, hold companies accountable through market mechanisms such as voting with your dollar, buying the things from companies that actually value making the dynamic and rapid changes that need to happen. I'd say first and foremost that's going to be the demand center is the public, all of us, not just in this room and the like 850 people at this conference, but really like making it unacceptable for companies to step back from claims and to hold them accountable in that way. Similar to how people have held governments accountable for bad actions in the past. I think that's our only real tool. That's our only real mechanism that we can do. We can make the projects perfect and beautiful in every way and expand the number of SDGs, but the demand only comes from when companies desire and then follow through on promises that they make to make the world a better place. And the carbon credits are probably the easiest lift for most companies to take in order to make those promises real. So it's kind of up to us.
Yeah. JP, we've covered a lot of ground. What do you think it's going to take to really kind of drive these markets forward and really expand them? And I'll use the S word, scale. Yes.
So one thing that we have not touched upon, and I think I should mention, is the lack of, collaboration and coordination between the members of the industry. We see how other industries in some sectors have been extremely effective at pushing regulation or delaying regulation depending on the objective. It seems like this industry was too busy competing with each other for a very long time, and people didn't see the train coming down the track until, you know, it was running over everyone. I've seen a lot of changes to that. I attended a meeting of BACA yesterday, which is a group of offset developers that are trying to work together to improve the messaging around the VCM. AITA, of course, is doing an outstanding job at, you know, various initiatives. But I think just, you know, going forward, and there's also, you know, all of the great work of the High Tide Foundation that I should not you know, omit mentioning. But, you know, going forward, having a better strategy, I think, is key to scaling things. And it needs to be a bit of an offensive strategy. We cannot always be on the back foot, defensive, trying to do damage control. It needs to be a strategy that anticipates the issues and address them, you know, upfront. So I think, you know, we need to do a better job at that.
Yeah, that's great. So we have just a few minutes left, and I'm gonna jump into our lightning round, and just ask for some
Whatever that means.
essentially one word answers. JP, if you could help me. So the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and skipping COP30, good, bad, or a non-factor?
Oh, it's bad.
Categorically.
Categorically bad.
Would have to agree with.
All right. Are quality tags for projects helpful, critical, needed? Yes or no?
One word answer.
You brought up the tag.
Yeah, so
thing.
compliance program tags are helpful for differentiating.
Potentially helpful.
Definitely helpful.
Okay.
Oh, definitely. There we go. Does blockchain, digitized assets, are those a solution in search of a problem or a real solution to a real problem in this market? JP?
Since I know nothing about blockchain, I think it's in search of a problem.
Part of the solution.
We'll say solution searching for a problem as it currently stands.
Okay. There are many forecasts for our market. I just happened to pick MSCI. They noted that the voluntary carbon market was about a little over $1 billion last year, 1.4 billion. Is expected for 2025 and will grow to a comfortable forecast of 7 to 35 billion in 2030. Would you agree with that projection?
Not an absence of demand taking action sooner. It takes a while.
I unfortunately disagree.
Yeah, JP?
MSCI,
We're going to top 7 billion and
that's Guy, right? That's Guy Turner? Yeah, so everything Guy says, I typically agree with. So the answer is yes. Hey, Guy, if you're here, you owe me dinner.
Last one, in one word, if you could change just one thing about the VCM, what would it be, Chelsea?
Perception?
Infighting.
Increased credibility, which goes to perception.
Very good. So we made it with a minute to spare here. I just want to say thank you very much for all your attention. Also, let's give a nice round of applause for our great panelists. I'm a little biased, but I'm going to say this was the best panel ever at the conference. So, but anyway, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you.